On a gray afternoon, a powerful CEO stepped out of his world of glass towers and polished shoes and into something he never expected. A moment that would break open his heart. There, on the steps of a community dance hall, sat a little girl in a lavender dress, crying quietly because it was the father-daughter dance, and she was alone. He could have kept walking, he almost did, but her small voice, "It's the daddy dance, and I'm alone," stopped him cold. What followed was more than kindness. It was the start of healing for two people who thought hope had passed them by. This is a story about second chances, about grief meeting grace, and about love found in the most unexpected places. Stay with us, because what begins with one dance becomes a family's forever. Subscribe now to Loss and Healing for stories that touch the soul. The afternoon wore a gray that felt almost deliberate, a sky that had chosen a single muted note and held it. The rain had passed but left behind a glassy sheen on the sidewalks, a reminder that the city had been rinsed clean and left to dry. Jackson Reed stepped away from the idling car and told his driver to give him 20 minutes. He did not explain why. He did not have the words for the heaviness in his chest, the particular fatigue that did not yield to expensive mattresses or silent elevators. He simply needed air that did not smell like leather and filtered climate control. He needed a street that did not know his name. From a distance, he looked like the photographs that had followed him into magazines and boardrooms. The suit that fit as though cut directly onto him, the shoes that mirrored the pale light, the hair that never seemed to misbehave. People tended to meet the surface and stop there. But after Claire died, the surface had become a kind of armor that no longer protected anything. He had kept moving, kept speaking, kept signing, and yet the internal noise did not quiet. Grief had not obeyed the calendar. It had not softened according to schedule. It sat with him in meeting rooms and car rides in the empty spaces of his penthouse, persistent as a low electric hum. He did not intend to stop. His feet did. He had drifted into a neighborhood he could not name, a place where the corners held laundromats, small cafes, and a dance studio wedged between them like a secret. A hand-painted sign rested on an easel. Annual Father-Daughter Dance, 5 p.m. The letters curled at the ends as if to soften the announcement. There was nothing remarkable about the studio. What held him in place was the small figure on the steps. She sat as though gravity had a gentler hold on her than it did on the rest of the world. A little girl in a lavender dress carefully chosen by someone who understood the importance of a ribbon and the comfort of a soft skirt. Her white shoes showed scuffs that told the story of a playground and a sidewalk and a hallway where she had practiced spinning. Her head was bowed, not dramatically, but with the kind of quiet that says, "I am trying to disappear without causing trouble." He almost passed. He almost followed the efficient script that had kept him moving through the previous year. Then she spoke. She did not look up when she said it. It slid into the air like a single bell tone. "It is the father-daughter dance, and I am alone." The words landed in his chest with a weight that did not crush so much as reveal. Something old in him shifted. He recognized the shape of the sentence, even though he had never said it aloud. He knew the sound of loneliness when it refused to raise its voice. He crouched. His knees complained about the sudden change, and his suit creased in places he usually guarded. None of it mattered. He saw her face then, and the world narrowed to sea-glass eyes and pale tracks on soft cheeks. He did not reach for the right line, because he did not have one. He reached for honesty, which had always been rarer for him than numbers and plans. "If you like," he said, "you can borrow me for one dance." The question stood between them, fragile and hopeful. She blinked once as if the wind had offered her a surprise. "Really?" He nodded. "Just tonight. I am not very good." "That is all right," she said. "I can teach you." Her hand fit into his with the small certainty children possess when they decide to trust. The contact was simple, palm to palm, and yet he felt it travel up his arm and settle in the place grief had burned hollow. In that touch, there was warmth that did not belong to pity or obligation. It belonged to presence. The studio door opened, releasing music that sounded like laughter and shared sugar cookies and a playlist made by someone who wanted everyone to feel welcome. Paper lanterns dangled from strings. The room inside glowed a little. She tugged at him with gentle authority. "They said I could come even without a dad, but it is better if I have one, even for one night." He let himself be led, He crossed the threshold and felt the peculiar sensation of a life clicking half a degree into alignment. Not a dramatic pivot, a fine adjustment that changed everything. Later, he would learn her name and the details of her favorite stickers and the rules of her blanket fort. For the moment, she was the girl in the lavender dress who had given him a reason to say yes to the next step. The floor shone with a polish that had seen countless sneakers and dress shoes. Dads in crooked ties tried to keep time while small hands directed them with generous patience. The air held the soft sweetness of cupcakes and faint citrus cleaner. He stood at the edge for a breath, aware of how ridiculous he felt in a world that did not require quarterly guidance. His hands hovered as if the wrong movement might cause something delicate to shatter. The girl, his partner, he corrected himself, did not hesitate. She placed his hand where it should go and set her own smaller hand in his other. Her confidence made space for his awkwardness to relax. "You are not so bad," she told him after a minute, and the tilt of her tiara suggested it had survived at least 3 spins too many. He laughed, not the polite sound he had used to signal camaraderie in rooms where he felt alone, but the unguarded kind he had not heard in his own throat since hospital hallways and whispered goodbyes. "I am told my knees are stiff." She studied them as if evaluating a piece of machinery. "Loosen them. Robots do not dance." She showed him, and the demonstration almost toppled her. He caught her without thinking, hands gentle at her sides, steadiness offered without ceremony. Again, the current moved through him. The feeling of being useful in a way that had nothing to do with strategy or capital. The song shifted, and so did the lighting, deeper colors blooming across the walls. Fathers circled back to daughters, smaller hands found larger ones, and someone in charge announced a slow number that made everyone laugh. He allowed himself to focus on the simple math of movement. One step, another, breathe, listen. He did not correct himself when he stumbled. She did not mind. They became 2 people moving through a room as if the rest of the world could afford to wait. Outside this room, life still carried the rough edges. His apartment would feel too quiet later. The email waiting on his phone would be full of language about a grid deal and a timeline no one believed. The chair at his dining table would continue to be empty. But inside the kaleidoscope of paper lanterns, his attention did not stray. Presence felt like a discipline and a gift, a practice he had forgotten he could choose. He noticed details because he wanted to hold on to them. The tiny crease where her ribbon had been tied with serious intent. The way she counted silently under her breath, lips moving with focus. The smile that arrived, not with a performance, but with connection. The smile that told him his decision to stop walking had mattered to someone. He imagined, for a moment, the woman who had sewn the ribbon or chosen the dress, the person who had tried to place a shield of beauty between a child and the sharpness of a world that can be indifferent. He did not know her yet. He felt the outline of her care. Somewhere in the room a camera clicked. He did not see who held it. He felt the small weight of a memory being made. He understood that he would want proof later, not because he would doubt the reality, but because he would want to return to it and remember how simple a door can be when it opens. When the music paused, he asked her name. "Maddie," she said, sudden shyness crowding the syllables. He tried it out softly, testing how it sounded in the space between them. She asked for his, he gave it. There was a solemnity in the exchange that did not feel childish. It felt like an agreement. Another song began. They kept moving. He would think later about the language people use for moments like this. Words like fate and destiny and meant to be. Standing on that floor, he did not think in large terms. He thought in increments. He thought in breaths that came easier, and a chest that felt less armored, and a stranger who did not feel like a stranger. He knew loss. He did not know yet that healing can begin so quietly that it sounds like a small hand saying, "This way, follow me." When they finally stepped outside for air, the city's damp coolness kissed his face. The gray had softened into evening. The sign on the easel leaned a little, and the chalk curls were smudged where a sleeve had brushed too close. He walked her to the steps where he had first seen her. She looked at the doorway as if listening to a song that had decided to follow her out. "Will you dance again if my mom says it is all right?" she asked, eyes cautious in a way that told him she had already learned to prepare for disappointment. "If she says yes," he answered, "I will be here." He meant it.
It is all right.
He felt the truth of it in the place that had been empty for too long.
I have you.
She squeezed his hand before she let go. He watched her go, then looked down at his open palm as though a map had been folded there for him. Perhaps the path back to a life is not a straight line. Perhaps it is a sway to music you cannot hear until someone smaller than you offers you the right to listen. She led him into the glow as if she had been born to part a small sea of legs and laughter. Inside, the colored lights swam across the polished floor. Paper lanterns bobbed in the breath of the room, and the music carried an uncomplicated joy that made the walls feel nearer and kinder. Fathers tried to remember middle school lessons about counting to 4. Daughters corrected them with patience that bordered on regal. He hovered at the edge for a heartbeat, a man in a perfect suit who felt as fragile as glass. Then, the little girl set his hand where it belonged and guided his other hand with a certainty that asked him to trust the moment. Trust came easier than he expected. At first, he moved like a man trying not to break something. His steps were careful in the way of people who have lost and are afraid of losing again. But she did not ask him to be graceful. She asked him to be present. When he stumbled, she squeezed his fingers and grinned, as if mistakes were proof that they were really here. "You are not so bad," she informed him with an authority that made the adults nearby smile. Her tiara listed to one side, showering glitter whenever she spun too enthusiastically. He laughed at himself, but not the way he did in rooms where laughter was a social tool. This laugh surprised him. It came from a place that had been quiet for too long. "Loosen your knees," she said, as though diagnosing a common condition. Robots do not dance. In demonstration, she attempted an ambitious twirl, then wobbled. He steadied her, hands at her sides, the protective reflex arriving faster than thought. The contact was simple and clean. Warmth moved through him again, not heat and not shock, but a hum that traveled to the hollow that grief had burned. He felt useful in a human way that did not appear on company reports. The songs changed, the tempo rose and fell, and the room reshaped itself around each chorus. He learned that she counted the beats under her breath, lips moving in tiny whispers that looked like prayer. He learned that she preferred to lead, and that leading for her meant inviting rather than dragging. He learned that when he listened to the small cues of her shoulders and the tug of her fingers, he could be good enough at this to make her laugh out loud. Good enough was a revelation. A camera clicked from somewhere near the refreshment table. A volunteer must have been roaming for keepsake moments, catching the awkward and beautiful blur of people who had chosen to show up. He did not pose. He did not adjust his tie. He forgot about his tie. 2 years from now, he would open a drawer and find the printed snapshot tucked next to a crayon drawing, and he would remember the exact tilt of her head and the way his own mouth looked when it forgot to defend itself. For now, he simply kept his rhythm while the air tasted like lemonade and the floor squeaked with sneakers and small patent leather shoes. They took a break by the back wall where the light fell softer. He asked her name, and she answered in a hush as if names were promises. "Maddie." He said it back as if returning a precious object. She asked his, and he offered it with less formality than he had expected. Jackson felt large and clumsy on his tongue. Jack felt like a costume he never wore. Jackson would do for tonight, and perhaps later there would be a version of it that belonged in rooms like this. The slow song came, and with it the courage of fathers who did not know how to lead but did not want their daughters to remember them as men who refused to try. He breathed and followed her count. He discovered that easing his shoulders down allowed his hands to loosen and his steps to grow less sharp. The music invited him into the present tense, and he accepted. For 3 minutes, he did not rehearse arguments or shepherd spreadsheets across his mind. For 3 minutes, he did not try to outpace pain. He chose to stand in the middle of it and still move. Across the city, a door opened into a small apartment that smelled faintly of hospital soap and coffee that had grown tired on a warming plate. Julia dropped her bag with the kind of exhale that only a 12-hour shift can wring out of a person. The messages on her phone stacked themselves with everyday demands, and then one arrived that made her still. Maddie had a great time at the dance. Ask her about the man in the gray suit. Alarm rose as clean and bright as a siren. What man? Why had no one called? The neighbor replied before fear had written its full script. Everything was more than fine. You will see. She saw. 20 minutes later, Maddie launched into her arms with a force that reorganized the furniture of the moment. There were lemonade smudges on her chin, and glitter clung to the curve of her cheek, the crown listing like a flag after a storm. The story poured out in bubbles and rushes, the man in the gray suit, the steps, the hand that had found hers without being told to. borrowed just for a dance. Julia listened with suspicious hope because hope had cost more than she could afford. Then the neighbor showed her the photo, and the caution cracked. The picture was not composed. It was not framed to flatter. It was a truth-telling sort of image. Her daughter mid-laugh, eyes shaped like joy, a small hand resting inside a larger one without fear. The man looked like he had arrived by mistake, and then discovered that the mistake was the point. Something in his face was unguarded in a way that expensive lives often forget how to be. Not pity, not indulgence, attention. The real kind? Julia felt a knot inside her loosen and tighten at the same time. She had built walls because it was her duty to keep the world from touching the soft parts of her child. The picture did not look like a breach. It looked like someone had stood beside her for a moment. Later, when the bathwater had pinked her daughter's cheeks and the lavender dress hung to dry, Julia sat in the quiet living room and let herself study the photo again. She traced the line of Maddie's smile with her thumb. She traced the way the man's shoulders had softened, the way his mouth had unlearned performance. Exhaustion lifted a little, as if a heavy book had been moved from the top of a stack. She thought about rent, about shifts, about the appointment on the calendar that she was already double booked for. Then her daughter's voice floated from the doorway of sleep. He said he would dance with me again if you say it is all right. The sentence was gentle, but it pushed on a door she had kept shut. Julia went to the doorway and watched her child breathe. She remembered the way Maddie had asked about her father when she was younger, the way the questions had stopped when answers did not arrive. She remembered the way a little girl can pack away hope to keep it from getting bruised. Maybe it was one dance, maybe it was nothing, but maybe not. Maybe it was the beginning of something kinder than loneliness. She was not naive. She did not confuse a snapshot with a background check. But she had learned, as nurses do, to read vital signs. Joy is a vital sign. Maddie's had spiked higher than it had in months. At the studio, the last song wound down and the room exhaled. He walked with Maddie back to the steps where the evening had found them. The sky had slipped into a softer gray that carried the first suggestions of night. "Will you dance again if my mother says yes?" she asked, trying to sound casual and failing with all the honesty of 6 years old. "If she says yes," he answered, "I will be here." He had never been more certain of anything he had said all day. When the door closed behind her and the street took her footsteps, he stood for a moment with his hands open at his sides. He did not feel triumphant. He felt responsible in a way that did not frighten him. He walked back to the car and told the driver to take the long way. The city passed in windows that held a different kind of reflection. He thought about a text that might arrive. He thought about flowers that were simple and not significant. Daisies, maybe. He thought about the difference between fixing and being with. It was a difference he had not fully understood until a small hand had taught him to count again. Somewhere across town, a woman who had taught herself not to hope scrolled past the photo and then scrolled back, unable to look away from the radiance on her child's face. She did not know if she would reach out. She did know that for the first time in a long time, the idea did not feel like a risk she could not take. It felt like a question worth asking. He stood outside the blue door at 3B, with daisies in his hand, and the kind of uncertainty that makes even a steady man feel like he is standing on a moving train. The message had been short and careful, a mother's voice in typed words that offered permission without warmth. Maddie would like to say thank you. Thursday, 4 o'clock. He had read it twice, then again, startled by the way his stomach had lifted like he had missed a step on a staircase. He wore an old flannel and jeans that did not know many public outings. He kept adjusting the ribbon around the flowers, as if neatness could disguise nerves. He knocked softly, 2 taps that suggested he would forgive the silence if no one answered. The door opened, and there she was, the small girl now without the lavender dress and crown, replaced by a shirt with a glitter unicorn and socks that did not match. Her face lit so brightly that the hallway seemed to change temperature. "You came," she squealed and flung herself against him with a confidence that felt like grace. He almost dropped the daisies. He did not. He folded himself around her for a second, breathing in the simple smell of crayons and shampoo. Before he could find the adult in the room, she appeared. The woman in the doorway wore hospital scrubs, and the kind of tired that settles in a person's bones when the clock has been unkind for a long time. Her hair was pulled back in a way that said she did not have time to consider another way. There were faint creases at the corners of her eyes, and a reflexive straightness in her posture, a shield that only softens when safety announces itself. He offered the flowers and heard himself admit that he was not entirely sure who they were for. For Maddie or for you? She took them like a person who has learned how to accept a gesture without committing to anything beyond politeness. "Thank you," she said. "You did not have to." "I know," he answered. "I wanted to." Inside, the apartment was small and honest. The couch sagged in the middle like it had earned the right to. Crayon drawings crowded the refrigerator with a persistence that suggested weekly updates. A small bookshelf leaned under the weight of fairy tales and picture books with taped spines. The coffee table held a stack of bills sorted into neat, unavoidable piles. A lavender blanket lay in a soft heap, as if someone had abandoned it in the middle of a giggle. He did not judge the space. He recognized it for what it was. A map of a life made carefully with not quite enough resources and more than enough love. Maddie dragged a binder the size of an encyclopedia out from under the table and announced that he needed to see the rocket unicorn. He knelt on the rug without hesitation. For 10 minutes, he let himself be a student. She turned the plastic sleeves with ceremony, and he admired each sticker as if it were a painting that required a museum plaque. He asked the kind of questions children deserve. Where did this one come from? Why is this one your favorite? Does the glitter one make it faster? She answered with the unembarrassed belief that her answers mattered. A mug of coffee appeared at his shoulder. He looked up and found the mother there, watching without staring, present without hovering. He thanked her. She sat at the other end of the couch, the daisies in a jar on the windowsill catching a square of late light. The room grew quiet in that way rooms do when something true is about to be said. "She has not stopped talking about the dance," the mother said, her voice less guarded. "Or you." He looked at the steam rising from his cup, searching for the right place to set the next sentence down. "She saved me that night more than I saved her," he said. "My wife died last year. Cancer. We never had children. We always said we would. We ran out of time." Her face changed without breaking. There is a way that people who spend their days in emergency rooms learn to hold another person's pain without turning away. She had that way. After a moment, she nodded. "My daughter used to ask about her father," she said. "She does not anymore. He left when she was 3. No warning, no goodbye. I have been stitching a life together ever since." He met her eyes and did not offer pity. Pity is a low flame that does not warm anyone. What he offered was recognition. "You have done a remarkable job," he said, and meant it. She looked almost startled by the sincerity, as if compliments had often arrived with a hook hidden inside. "Thank you," she said, and the words landed between them like the first step on a bridge. Maddie ran to her room and returned with a drawing. 3 stick figures under a rainbow, holding hands. One wore a gray suit that did not match his current flannel. One had a messy braid that had escaped its hair tie. One had a giant purple crown that seemed to hum with importance. "It is us," she announced, "just in case you forget." He felt his throat tighten. "I will not forget," he said. She leaned closer and whispered the question as if it were fragile. "You will come back, right?" He looked at the mother, because this was not his decision to make alone. For a beat, the room held still. Then the mother nodded. "Yes, he can come back." When he stepped back into the hallway, the paper drawing safely tucked in his hand, he did not feel like a man who had performed a kindness. He felt like a man who had been allowed to begin something. The city smelled different on the walk to his car. He told his driver the ride would be short and tried not to smile at nothing. He returned, first with takeout on nights when she worked too late to cook, then with a tiny toolkit that he did not exactly know how to use, then with a willingness to be the extra pair of hands that life in a small apartment always needs. He learned that Maddie believed chicken nuggets were a food group, as long as there was barbecue sauce. He learned that a squeaky cabinet hinge can be a soundtrack until it is not, and that sometimes fixing one drip in a sink creates a temporary waterfall, and that the sound of a child's laughter while she holds a flashlight can make a soaked shirt feel like an award. He did not linger to be noticed. He stayed because leaving began to feel like a mistake. The penthouse at the end of his nights was still immaculate and quiet, the kind of quiet that magnifies absence. The apartment on 3B was a place where music from a television in another room drifted into the kitchen while waffles cooled on a plate, where crayons refused to return to their box, and where a pair of small sneakers always waited by the door for a tomorrow that would need them. One Sunday, he found himself crouched in a living room fort made of 3 chairs and 2 blankets, wearing a pink hair clip because the director had said the cast required it. The director was 6 years old and unarguably persuasive. The mother walked by with a mug and raised an eyebrow that carried humor and something warmer. "She has you wrapped around her finger," the mother observed. He nodded from under the blanket avalanche and admitted that she did. The sound of the mother's laugh filled the room in a way that made his chest tense with the good kind of ache. That night, he stood in the doorway of the small bedroom and watched the rise and fall of a child who had fallen asleep in the middle of a story. Her favorite stuffed bear lay beneath an arm. One of his flannel shirts had been confiscated for reasons of comfort and law. The mother joined him, her shoulder brushing his. "Do you remember the first time you felt seen?" she asked in the hush of a hallway. He thought of a lecture hall long ago and a young woman with bright eyes who had insisted that he know what he was talking about. "Yes," he said, "I do." "She would have liked you," he added, and the mother's eyes flicked to his with a quick, surprised light. Later that week, he arrived with groceries and a declaration. "I am attempting spaghetti," he said, and was teased appropriately. The garlic bread burned a little, the sauce leaned too heavily on ambition, but the kitchen filled with laughter that made the meal into something close to sacred. Hands brushed and did not move away quickly. He was not performing help. He was inhabiting belonging, even if no one had named it yet. The next afternoon, he walked Maddie to the park while the mother took a call. He pushed the swing higher when she asked with absolute faith that the sky would make room. He promised the moon would have to wait its turn. He did not know yet that a question would arrive soon that would rearrange the furniture of his heart. For the moment, he was content with the rhythm of push and laughter, the easy arithmetic of joy. He went home that night and set the drawing with the 3 figures on his desk. He placed it next to a framed photograph of a woman with a field of sunlight behind her, and he understood that grief had not left him and did not need to leave for love to enter. There is a way to make room. There is always a way if you are willing to stand still long enough to let a small hand find yours and say, "Here is the door." She pumped her legs like she wanted to rearrange the sky, squealing higher each time the swing arced forward. He stood just behind, hands ready in the way that gives a child courage. When she leapt midair and landed in a wobbly hero pose, she looked up at him with the bright seriousness only children manage. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course," he said, bracing without knowing why. "Can I call you Daddy Jackson?" The world did not stop, but it felt as if everything important stepped closer to listen. He did not rush. He did not pretend the question was small. "Only if you really want to," he said, "because names have weight and promises have edges." She nodded like it was settled truth. "I do. You feel like one." Then she sprinted away, chasing a squirrel with airplane arms as if a new name had given her additional lift. On the walk home, his chest held a tenderness that did not ache. He told himself to move carefully with it, not because it would break, but because he wanted to honor where it had come from. That night, when the apartment was quiet and the city hummed through the windows, he called his sister. He had expected teasing. He received silence that held a kind of loving caution. "It sounds beautiful," she said finally, "and it does not erase what you lost. Be certain you are building something new, not building a monument to what is gone." "I know," he said, and he did. This did not feel like filling a hole. It felt like planting something in good soil and waiting for a first leaf. The letter arrived like a storm cloud folded into a white envelope. Julia had sorted the mail while standing, the way people do when they already know there is nothing good in the stack. Bills, flyers, a dentist reminder printed in cheerful font, then handwriting she recognized and did not expect to see again. She opened it at the kitchen counter and felt her jaw lock as she read, "I want to see my daughter." Words that did not ask. Words from a man who had left without returning a single message, who had let birthdays pass with the quiet of a closed door. There was a line about hearing that she had been spending time with a successful man. A line that smelled like entitlement and cologne. "A kid needs her father," the page insisted. Julia dropped the letter to the floor and sat hard. Her body did not tremble with fear. It heated with anger. He had no right to use the word father as if it were a key he could pick up whenever it suited him. Jackson read the letter that evening with the careful attention of a person disarming something that could harm if handled poorly. "Has he called?" he asked. "No, only this." "Do you have anything in place legally?" She shook her head and pressed the heel of her hand to her brow. I truly thought he was gone. That was the deal. Disappear and stay disappeared. He set the letter down and reached for her hand. Whatever happens, he said, you are not in this alone. The sentence did not perform heroics. It offered partnership. She had not had that kind of sentence spoken to her in years. She breathed like someone had opened a window. 2 weeks later, paperwork arrived with the dense language of people who treat lives like puzzles to be solved by procedure. A petition for joint custody, thick with apologies carefully excavated of responsibility. He claimed he had been denied access. He claimed he had always intended to return. He claimed that a child belongs to a father, no matter the distance of his absence. She wanted to tear the papers in half and then tear them again. Instead, Jackson called a lawyer he knew from a nonprofit where he served on the board. The man who arrived with a worn briefcase and quiet eyes listened more than he spoke. He marked the dates, the missed payments, the missed years. Abandonment matters, he said. Lack of contact matters. We will show the court who has been present and who has not. Presence, in the meantime, became a practice. Julia found the edges of her patience more easily now, not because there was less to carry, but because someone else lifted one side without being asked. Jackson was there in the kitchen to reach the high shelf, and there at the table to pronounce spelling words that turned silly and then serious again. He was there in the hallway on nights when Maddie woke shaking from a dream she could not name. He would sit on the rug and tell a story about a brave girl who carried a lantern that never went out. He would stay until Maddie's breath evened, and the lantern's glow felt strong enough to stand on its own. Chase did not stay theoretical. He appeared across the street from the school in a collared shirt and dark glasses, as though fresh laundry and a pair of sunglasses could remake a man. Julia saw him before Maddie did. She walked straight across the pavement and set a boundary with a voice she did not need to raise. You do not get to linger near her. Not now, not ever. I have a right, he said smoothly. No, she answered. Rights are earned with presence. She walked away on shaking legs because even a righteous confrontation drains the body. That night, Maddie climbed into her lap without asking and stayed there longer than usual. The next morning, her teacher sent an email that used words like withdrawn and distracted. Julia read it twice and closed her eyes. Jackson said nothing stupid like it will be fine. He came over with pancakes and did the voices in Maddie's favorite book until she laughed in a way that sounded like her again. On a late evening, after Julia had pulled back the covers and kissed a forehead that smelled like shampoo, Maddie looked up at Jackson with the gravity of a solemn oath. Are you still my daddy, Jackson, if that man comes back? He sat beside her and smoothed a stray hair from her eyes. Yes, he said, I am still yours no matter what. From the hallway, Julia watched, one hand over her mouth to keep sound from escaping. After Maddie slept, she brought out a photo album she had not opened in a long time. The early pages held chubby wrists and icing-smeared smiles, the middle pages thinned, the later pages contained blank sleeves she had meant to fill. I do not know why I am so frightened, she said softly. I have been doing this alone for so long. He turned one page and stopped at a picture where Maddie grinned with new front teeth and a missing shoe. Because now the stakes are different, he said. You have let someone in. That is not weakness. That is courage. The courthouse looked the way courthouses always look in films. Wood polished by many hands, ceilings a little too high, air that smelled like paper and old arguments. He sat beside Julia while her attorney organized documents into stacks. Across the aisle, Chase had trimmed his beard and practiced his expression. The judge asked questions few and precise. The attorney for Julia answered with timelines and facts that never raised their voice. When the judge requested to speak with Maddie privately, Julia's throat tightened. A child psychologist with kind eyes ushered Maddie into a smaller room. They waited. Waiting stretches time until even breathing feels like a decision. When the door opened, the psychologist nodded with a small smile. She did well. Very well. Back in the courtroom, the judge spoke in a calm voice that nevertheless filled the space. She said that the law places the child's best interest above all else. She said that absence leaves its own evidence. She said she had listened to the child. When asked who her father is, the judge recounted. She said, My real dad did not leave. He helped me tie my ribbon. He taught me how to spin at the dance. He came back when he did not have to. That is the kind of dad I want.
Thank
Jackson
you.
held his breath because letting it out would become a sound. The judge denied the petition. No joint custody, no visitation.
water.
The gavel came down like mercy. Outside on the steps, the city air felt warmer than the season allowed.
I know.
Julia stared at the sky and wrapped her arms around herself, as if her body needed time to trust the ground again. He asked if she was all right. She said she did not know what she felt. Relief, anger, gratitude, all of it tangled. Then she looked at him and added, "She chose you." He did not know where to put that sentence, so he placed it in the safest part of him and held it carefully. He gathered her into his arms and she did not resist. For the first time in a very long time, she allowed herself to be held in a way that did not require her to be strong. That night, when he tucked Maddie in, she asked if they were safe now. Julia answered from the doorway, "We are better than safe, sweetheart. We are together." Later, she went to the living room where he sat with a cup of tea and the crayon drawing that had started everything. She said that her daughter had asked if he would stay forever. He asked what she had said. "I told her I loved you," Julia whispered. The room seemed to exhale with them. For once,
Thank
grief
you.
did not stand between them like a pillar. It stood beside them and made room for what had arrived. The days that followed did not feel like a parade. They felt like a deep breath that had been waiting behind the sternum for years. Morning light came through the kitchen window a little kinder, as if it had learned the names of the people it touched. The apartment began to speak in plurals. His toothbrush found a quiet corner in the ceramic cup. His
How many
jacket
do you want
learned
for
the hook by the
breakfast?
door.
Oh, I
The
think
laundry
4 is
basket learned a new
enough.
rhythm, smaller socks mixing themselves into the pile as if to say they belonged. He did not ask what needed doing when he arrived. He rolled up his sleeves and looked for it. Groceries appeared in the fridge that understood what Maddie liked without asking.
Can we
Spelling
build
words
a
turned into jokes that
fort?
tripped into laughing
Of
fits
course.
and then returned to seriousness because homework still had borders. On Saturdays, they walked 3 blocks to the bookstore, and Maddie chose paperbacks with covers that promised adventures she would narrate in her own voice on the couch later. She pretended to
You are
read while he
king
pretended to be
now.
surprised by the plot. Spring came softly over the city, not with fanfare but with tiny announcements. Tree buds cracked open, the sidewalks loosened from winter. In the late afternoon, when the sun decided the neighborhood deserved a gold wash, the air through the apartment felt like permission. Julia noticed that the familiar tightness between her shoulder blades did not arrive every evening. There were still long shifts and difficult patients and bills that did not care about anything except their due dates. But she was no longer the only person standing in every doorway. He collected the plastic containers after dinner without being asked. He reached the high shelf. He caught the pot before it clattered. When the shower faucet squealed and then sighed, he took it apart and put it back together with the patience of a person who had learned that repair is a form of love. They were not
It is
trying
really
to live a
nice here.
movie. They were trying to live a Tuesday well,
is really
and then
pleasant.
another, and then a
Yes, it
Sunday
is.
with waffles that came off the pan a little uneven and tasted perfect. Sometimes he would come home to the sound of music from a phone speaker and the smell of coffee that had gone past its best intention. He would lean in the doorway and watch Julia dance with Maddie between the table and the sink, small feet stepping on bigger feet, a paper crown barely staying on a head that learned confidence one twirl at a time. He did not interrupt. Some beauty is best witnessed, then joined. There were reminders of the battle they had just won. An envelope from the court with
That's
stamped
quite a
language
smoke
to
show.
file away. A manila folder marked with dates, evidence, statements. Julia kept it in the drawer with the batteries and the tape measure. She would open it sometimes, not to relive the fear, but to look
So
at
what,
the
is this
signature
for
that
your
protected
restaurant, or
them.
is this for
Then
us?
she would close it
This
and
is
reach for a
for
pen
us.
to sign a permission slip. And life would continue the way it does after storms. Things are still damp. The ground is still soft. Flowers try anyway.
That is really
One evening,
funny.
as the city folded itself into dusk, he came home with a coil of lights and a look on his face that made Maddie clap just because surprises live-in looks like that. He had stopped at a hardware store and picked up a string of small bulbs that promised to make ordinary spaces into places where
what did you
conversations
make for
could sit
dinner?
down and
I
stay.
made your favorite.
He installed them along the narrow
lasagna.
porch outside the apartment, looping them carefully between the nails as if each bulb were the start of a sentence. Maddie followed with tape and paper and scissors, a constellation of stars and tissue flowers blooming along the railing. Julia stood barefoot at the threshold with a smile that lifted one corner of her mouth, amused and softened at once. "You are dramatic," she said. "Ambiance matters," he replied, mock serious. And she laughed because he believed it. and because he had turned 6 square feet of wood into a stage for the kind of moments that do not require witnesses. They stood together under the soft light as evening settled into the street. He took her hand, not to perform, but to be exact about what touch can say when words do not want a crowd. They did not move much. A slow sway, a small orbit. The city noise melted into a hum that could have been a faraway song. He told her that he had believed grief was a thing you outlast, a tide you simply endure until it recedes. He told her he had discovered that grief is a room that makes space for other rooms if you let it. She met his eyes and did not fill the silence. Some truths want to ring for a while. He reached into his jacket and found the box that had sat in his pocket like a heartbeat. It was not the restaurant with the linen napkins he had imagined. It was not the violinist who could have appeared on cue. It was the porch where Maddie had handed him his first crayon family, and where garlic bread had burned, and where laughter had survived shift schedules and paperwork. This, he said, is better. He opened the box, and the ring inside did not shout. It glowed. A small emerald with 2 diamonds, a line of green between points of light. It looked like something meant to be worn while making lunches and finding missing socks. A piece of beauty that did not ask to be protected from ordinary life. He did not speak a speech. He said a plain thing plainly. I do not want to be a maybe. I want to be your partner in this every morning and every night, for the years that make us different and the years that make us the same. I want to argue about grocery lists and read bedtime stories and grow old beneath these lights or the next ones. The sound she made was a quiet inhalation that carried love and terror and relief together. Tears came. She laughed at herself for them and did not apologize. Yes, she said, with a softness that somehow carried steel. Yes, because you are the only man who has made me feel safe and alive at once. Yes, because you do not rescue us. You stand with us. He slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that remembered shaking for very different reasons. They kissed in a way that made time widen. It was not cinematic, it was real. From behind the curtain, a child's eye watched round and bright, and then disappeared down the hall in the particular thunder of small feet, determined to make art. When they went back inside, Maddie was ready with a card lettered in glitter that shed itself generously onto their clothes. I told you we were already a family, it read, which in the language of children is both proclamation and blessing. Life began to shift around the new shape of them. The porch lights became their place to stand on good nights and difficult ones, to make decisions about plumbers and pediatric visits, to talk about money without flinching, to dream with restraint and then with courage. His calendar, once a fortress, learned to give way to school plays and spelling bees, and the occasional afternoon that demanded a fort made of chairs again. He continued to be careful with the memory of the woman he had loved and lost. He did not tuck Claire away in a box and pretend the past had closed. Instead, he learned to set her picture where it could stay, and somehow not cast a shadow on the present. Love does not compete when it knows its own name. There were days that did not look inspiring on paper. Diaper bags appeared because the future had already started whispering in ways they did not announce to anyone else yet. Groceries were forgotten and then remembered. The sink backed up, and he learned once again the humility of calling someone who knew what they were doing. There was laughter that came too close to crying and crying that turned to laughter before it landed. Through all of it, a child in a paper crown tested her spins in the hallway and asked if he could watch. He always could. He always did. One night, after Maddie had fallen asleep with a pen clasped in her hand like a tiny scepter, they stood by the window and watched the city lights measure out the blocks. He said that he used to believe he could outrun emptiness by staying busy enough. She said that she used to believe letting anyone in would mean losing what little control she had. They both stood there and understood that some beliefs have to be replaced by better ones, not by argument, but by the quiet accumulation of days that prove themselves. When he finally put away the ladder and turned off the porch lights, the room held its own glow. He felt it in the way their shoulders leaned toward each other without thinking, in the way the ring caught a sliver of lamplight and returned it. The ground did not shift beneath them. It steadied. They arrived early because she insisted, because this year was different, because being on time felt like honoring how far they had come. The same community center glowed with strings of fairy lights and paper lanterns that turned the air into a soft celebration. The chalkboard by the door announced the father-daughter dance at 5 o'clock in the same looping hand as last year. but the words seemed to carry a new meaning. He shifted the sleeping toddler against his chest in the soft gray wrap, felt small breaths warm through the fabric, and smiled at the way a tiny hand had left a damp crescent on his tie. His suit still fit as if it had been stitched with him in mind, but he moved differently now, not in a way that demanded space, in a way that made space. Maddie ran ahead to the steps where she had once sat alone. She did not stop. She twirled on the landing just because the air was there to twirl in, because the skirt of her blue satin dress caught the light and made it run like water. She looked back to him with a grin that asked if he was watching. He always was. Inside, the room hummed with the same sounds as before, laughter that made the floorboards generous, music that did not need to be perfect to be exactly right. Volunteers stuck name tags to shirts and handed out cups of lemonade that sweated onto napkins. Parents adjusted collars and crooked tiaras. Ordinary magic filled the spaces between conversations. Julia stood at the refreshment table with a calm that came from a season of sleeping without looking at the clock every hour. The navy dress she wore did not try to be a statement. It fit the person she had become. Steady, luminous, in the quiet way that endures. When he touched his lips to her temple, the gesture felt like an old vow renewed. The ring on her hand caught the light and returned it softly. Married was not a costume. It was a way of moving through a room together, of crossing a threshold and knowing the other person's step by sound. She had pinned Maddie's ribbon with care this time, and it held. The performance began. The lights lowered a shade, and a hush moved across the room like a tide. The girls entered in a line that bowed and swayed. In the center, Maddie stood with a composure that had not been there a year ago. She counted only in her mind now, and when another girl missed a beat, she adjusted with a tiny nod that said, "Follow me, we have this." Jackson felt his throat tighten, not with sadness, with a fullness that did not need repairing. Ellie stirred and settled, the soft weight of her a reminder that love multiplies without asking for permission. He watched the dance not as an audience member waiting to be impressed, but as a witness to a life that had found its way. When a little one tripped, Maddie reached out and lifted her with a grace that felt older than the moment. The music continued. The paper lantern swayed with the air. His eyes burned as he saw a child who no longer looked around a room for proof she belonged. She did not ask the room for permission to be there. She inhabited it. When the applause rose, he stood without thinking, clapping a little harder than everyone else, because he could not help it. Maddie found him in the crowd and smiled a private smile that broke him and rebuilt him in the same second. He lifted a hand that was full of a baby and a life, and managed a wave that she answered with the tilt of her head. After the bows, the floor opened and movement scattered everywhere. He made his way forward, weaving through clusters of parents and daughters, the soft bump of shoulders and the brush of sequins against sleeves. Maddie ran into him at a safe speed and hugged as high as she could reach around a father who also held her sister. "Was I amazing?" she asked with breathless certainty. "You were everything," he said, and meant all the versions of that word. She handed him a folded paper that had already collected the fingerprints of a happy day. "I wanted to wait," she said, "but now is better." He opened it carefully, aware that some papers should not be rushed. 4 figures under a banner that read "My Family." A tall man in a tie that had endured a toddler. A woman with a messy bun drawn like a crown of its own. A girl with a tiara tilted deliberately. A baby with cheeks that were 2 perfect circles. They held hands beneath a heart that spanned the width of the page. "Thank you for dancing with me," the bottom line said in pink letters that turned the page into a certificate. He looked at Julia. She looked back at him, eyes bright with the kind of tears that celebrate. He looked at Maddie and said, "You chose me." She shrugged with the elegance of a queen and answered, "You did not walk past." He pulled them both close, with care for the sleeping baby and for the moment itself. He did not try to speak around the thickness in his throat. Later there would be words. For now, holding was language enough. They swayed there, 3 parts of a 4, before the music reminded them that this was a dance floor and movement is an honest form of gratitude. When the hall had emptied of most of its energy and the paper lanterns bobbed more tiredly, they stepped into the evening. The street felt friendly in the way streets sometimes do when they have witnessed something that matters. The city did not know them and did not need to. It offered them a night that smelled like rain remembered and stone warmed by a day's work. At home, their small porch had been replaced by a wider one that overlooked a yard mapped by dandelions and a swing that had been measured and installed with tenderness. There were planters that did not yet hold flowers, only soil that promised when the time was right something would push through. They sat. Ellie sighed in sleep and pinched a bit of Julia's sweater in her fist. Maddie came out, still wearing her medal with the seriousness of someone guarding a treasure. She leaned against Jackson's side as if he had always been the place to lean. The stars were small and sincere above them. "It is wild," he said after a quiet that had filled itself with comfort. "One step outside my routine changed everything." "Not just one step," she answered. "One choice, and not just yours. She chose you too." He looked toward the hallway where a tiara had been placed carefully on a dresser, and he felt the truth of it settle around him like the porch light on his shoulders. The night folded itself around them.
Are you all right?
The swing creaked a little as the breeze moved it. A neighbor's radio drifted in and out of hearing. He thought of the first time he had seen the chalkboard sign and the small figure on the steps. He thought of the ledger he used to keep in his mind, where loss was tallied with such precision that nothing else seemed to be allowed a line. He wondered at the audacity of joy, at its ability to take up space without apology. He wondered at the strength of a choice made by a little girl in a lavender dress who had decided to say yes to a stranger, and by a woman who had decided to open a door she had kept closed for good reasons.
Are we safe now?
He felt no need to define it beyond the words they already had. Family, home, ours. Before bed, Maddie stood at the porch's edge and practiced one more spin because endings ask for a flourish. She wobbled and caught herself and laughed, then came to him and leaned into his side again. He kissed the top of her head, the same place he had steadied months ago when his spin had almost tipped her over. The spot felt like a compass point now. Later, when the house had become a collection of steady breaths and the quiet clatter of night settling, he stood in the hallway and looked at the framed drawing on the wall. Beneath it, on a table, sat a photograph taken by a volunteer with an old camera. The man in the image had been caught mid-laugh, his tie slightly loosened, his eyes turned toward a child whose hand was in his. Next to it, another photograph, newer, showed a man with a baby sleeping against his chest, a girl smiling with a medal, and a woman looking at them as if she had finally been allowed to rest. He did not think about endings. He thought about continuations. The dance had not concluded with applause and a bow. It had stretched into days and groceries and bedtime stories and courtrooms and porches. It had kept time through grief and made room for delight. Standing there, he understood that the music had never really stopped after that first borrowed dance. It had only changed tempos, inviting him into a life that was not about performance, but about presence. He turned off the hall light and the house seemed to glow anyway, as if it had memorized where the joy lived and kept it lit. Some stories do not end when the music fades. They live on in the quiet places, the hallway where a child hangs her tiara after a long night, the porch where two people learn to laugh again, the living room where crayons and coffee cups share the same table. Jackson never planned to stop on that Portland street. Never planned to kneel before a little girl in a lavender dress whose eyes carried both storm and light. Yet that single step, that single choice, became the first thread in a tapestry he didn't know he was weaving.
How was school today?
What began as one borrowed dance grew into something stronger than grief, stronger than absence, stronger even than fear. It grew into a home. Maddie, once sitting alone outside a father-daughter dance, now twirls with confidence, knowing her place in the world is secure. Julia, once exhausted and braced against disappointment, now breathes with ease beside a partner who does not rescue her but stands with her. And Jackson, once armored in silence and hollowed by loss, now holds his daughters in his arms and realizes the music has never really stopped, it only changed its rhythm. This is not a fairy tale polished to perfection. The bills are still on the table, the faucet still leaks sometimes, the nights can still be long. But love is not proven in grand gestures alone. It is proven in groceries carried upstairs, in bedtime stories read when eyes are tired, in the willingness to sit in silence and still stay. It is proven when a child says, "You didn't walk past," and the truth of that becomes the foundation of a family. Perhaps you too have stood at a doorway between despair and hope. Perhaps you have lost someone, or felt the weight of being left behind, or carried the burden of doing everything alone. This story is a reminder that healing often begins in the smallest of choices. To stop, to listen, to open your hand when someone reaches out. One act of presence can ripple outward until it changes a life. Sometimes, even 2 or 3. At Loss and Healing, we believe stories like this matter. Stories where grief does not vanish, but makes room for love. Stories where strangers become family, where resilience blooms in unlikely places, where second chances find their way to people who thought they had no more chances left. If this journey has touched your heart, if you saw a piece of yourself in Maddie, Julia, or Jackson, we invite you to join our community. Subscribe to Loss and Healing today, so you never miss a reminder that even in the darkest seasons, light can return. Together, we can keep telling stories that honor loss, celebrate love, and remind us all that healing is possible. The dance does not end here. For them, for us, for you, it has only just begun.